right, 25 minutes before 11 o'clock. For the past 16 years, Robin and I have been interviewing guests every morning here on AM Ocala Live, and I've heard enough from the listeners out there that I know that some of you listen, and then you say, who are they talking to? What are they talking about? And if it's not interesting to you, then you find someplace else to listen, right?
Yeah.
I would do the same thing. I don't blame you sometimes, but I'm guessing you're going to want to hear this one. This is a good one.
Yeah.
We have on the phone Tom Clavin. He's a well-known author. Got a lot of books to his name. This new one is called Wild Bill, the true story of the American frontier's first gunfighter. And you know how much I knew about Wild Bill before, Robin?
How much?
I knew his last name.
Yeah.
Hickok. I didn't know how to spell it, though, but that's all I knew. And let's see, what else did I know about him? I thought he was the same. I think Wild Bill and Cody, I thought they were the same. Mm-hmm. I didn't know they were two different guys. So Tom's educating me on the Wild West, which I understand it wasn't really all that wild, right? It was
it was
a misname.
Yeah.
Tom Clavin, good morning. It's an honor to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Where are you calling from?
I live in a small town on very eastern part of Long Island called Sag Harbor.
Oh, yeah. I think we talked before. I'm not so sure.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. What did we talk about? Joe DiMaggio? Was it a baseball book?
I did a book called The DiMaggios about Joe, Dominic, and Vincent, the three DiMaggio brothers who all played Major League Baseball.
Oh, my gosh. So where do you get the inspiration? From baseball to the Wild West? Explain your brain to me a little bit.
Well, sometimes things just happen to fall in my lap. I could be researching one thing and another thing comes up and it looks like an interesting story. And in the case of Wild Bill, it was actually the suggestion of my editor, because I had a book come out a couple of years ago called Dodge City, which was about Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson and the 1870s. And, thank goodness the book came out and it got on all kinds of bestseller lists and sold a lot of copies. And my editor said, can you think of some other iconic, American West figure that people have that name recognition for it? And the first thing that occurred to me is Wild Bill Hickok. And then what I found out is that people, like you said, in your intro, you know the name, and you might even know the last name, Wild Bill Hickok, but most people don't know what a very complicated and amazing kind of figure he was in the American West after the Civil War. So that's what the book is about, to let people know that this was really an iconic figure, and he deserved that reputation.
A real guy, and we like to learn the real story about the real guys, because movies and TV, they don't always do it justice. How were you able to research this? Was he keeping records of his own life, or was he making the news all the time? How did records survive that you were able to research?
It was a good news, bad news thing. To go to the bad news first, he died. He was only 39 years old, and he did not get a chance to, like Wyatt Earp did, like Bat Masterson did, get to be an older man and be able to be interviewed and reflect upon and try and make the record straight about accuracy. So Wild Bill never had that opportunity. The other thing that was bad news is that, unlike when Dodge City, you had two newspapers at the time, Wild Bill roamed around a lot. He wasn't in one particular place, so the newspaper coverage of him at the time was kind of spotty. Good news was, what really helped is he did like to write letters. I mean, some people might think of him as this itinerant plainsman that probably didn't know how to read or write. He did, and he liked to write letters back home to his brothers and his mother in Illinois. When he fell in love, he was writing letters to his girlfriend. So there are these letters that exist, and you can get some of the real voice of Wild Bill Hickok into the book.
No, that is really cool. And so a lot of that research was found where? Did you have to go to those cities in the West, to maybe some old library somewhere?
Yes, because the two or three places that were really helpful is the Kansas State Historical Society and the Kansas Heritage Center, and also Buffalo Bill Cody Museum of the West has archives of, and their library there is getting bigger and bigger and bigger as the curators there acquire more material. So you go to these places and you get a chance to sit down, and sometimes they have to bring you out something in plexiglass. It might be somebody's diary from 1860 asphyxiate, and you have to wear these white gloves because even the oil on your fingers would start to destroy the ink or the paper itself. So for nerds like me that enjoy going to libraries, you get this real sense of discovery when you're reading something that people actually wrote, either by Bill Hickok or about him.
I also grew up on Long Island, and I was not a good history student, but since doing this show, I've learned that some of the things in our history happened like right around the corner from where I grew up. In a way, I mean, Aaron Burr shot Alexander Hamilton on the other side of the Hudson. I had no idea it was that close, and I think some of those things make it more interesting for a guy like me who just for some reason felt like it was ancient history and not relatable to me. And I think that's what you're doing with this as well.
Yeah, it's also almost like a travel book, too, because, like I said, with my book, Dodge City, that was basically rooted in that one place in that one particular time. Hickok was all over the place. I mean, he was a plainsman. That's why they named the movie The Plainsman with Gary Cooper and Gene Arthur, that old movie from the 30s about Hickok and Calamity Jane. But he was a frontier, so he was a scout for the U.S. Army. He was a scout for hunting parties. He would take them all to Wyoming, the Dakotas, Nebraska, Colorado, New Mexico. He was a very, very well-traveled guy, so that's part of the fun of the book is this happened in Wyoming, this happened in South Dakota, this happened in Kansas, and I think a lot of people reading it are going to find out, oh, wow, that happened only 30 miles from me.
And you introduced us to Agnes Lake. She was quite a character.
Well, thank you for bringing that up, because that was one of the nice surprises of this book, because in our popular culture, Hickok has always been linked with Calamity Jane. And, of course, she's in the book. She's a fascinating character. But I get a chance to reveal to readers that the real love of Wild Bill Hickok's life was Agnes Lake, who was one of the most remarkable women of the 19th century. She was the only female circus impresario in the country. She was the rival of Barnum and Bailey, who were not together at the time. They had their own circuses, the Ringling Brothers, and she would take her circus all over the country, and eventually she performed in Europe. She was this amazing character, and she's the one that Wild Bill Hickok fell in love with.
So paint a picture of the West for us in those years. We always hear it as the Wild West. What was it really like, especially where he was?
It could get kind of wild because, Bill started to become more well-known as Wild Bill, and especially as a gunfighter after the Civil War was over in those years in the late 1860s and early 70s. And he was the marshal, for example, of Abilene, Kansas. And it was pretty wild because you had these cow towns where the railroad would show up, and the Texas cattle barons would drive their cattle, thousands of head, to these towns where the railroad was, where they would sell them. And there was very little law and order. The cowboys would get paid off. They'd have pockets full of money. They'd been on this dusty trail for weeks. They wanted to party. And so, the lawmen were few and far between. It was a very high-risk job. You didn't get paid much. There was no 401k. There were none of these benefits. Really. So until people like Hickok, who became sort of like the prototype of that post-Civil War frontier lawman, came along and said, listen, here's the law. I'm going to establish the law. I'm going to enforce it. Things really were. It really was the Wild West for a while.
How did you get the name Bill? From what I understood, his name is not really Bill or William.
It's James Butler Hickok. Yeah, he had a brother named Lorenzo who was called Bill, and then Lorenzo started calling him Bill, and so he decided, I like the name Bill. So he kept the name Bill, and the wild part came about was in the first year of the Civil War. He was walking past a saloon. There's a commotion going on, and people told him that the bartender had expressed some support for the Southern cause. And 6 other guys in there who were Union guys decided to show him the error of his ways with their fists. Now, I should point out, Hickok grew up in an abolitionist family. His father's farm was a station on the Underground Railroad. They actually helped the slaves to escape. So he was very much anti-slavery, but he also hated a unfair fight. And he saw that bartender being beaten up by 6 guys. He jumped in there on the side of the bartender. It was a big fight. And later on that day, word got around what he had done, this crazy thing he had done, and this woman called out to him, "Way to go, Wild Bill." And that name stuck. And from that point to today, we know him as Wild Bill Hickok.
Mm-hmm. And you pointed out that he was a Union soldier and that he used his cunningness to be a spy.
He was. During the Civil War, he had enlisted in the Union Army. He had seen action as a scout and a sharpshooter and messenger. But then he went behind enemy lines, and he would wear Confederate officer uniforms to infiltrate even the staffs of generals to get information, and then he would manage to get this information back to the Union side. And several times, very, very close scrapes. In fact, one time he was caught in a Confederate uniform, and he was tried on the spot and sentenced to be executed at dawn and locked up. And fortunately, he figured out a way to escape and make his way to the Union lines a couple of nights later. But he was almost like a fearless guy, and that serves you well when you're faking being a Confederate officer behind enemy lines.
And what drew him to become a U.S. Marshal?
He did. You know, in those days, there were U.S. Marshals and there were deputy U.S. Marshals, because you had all these, hundreds of thousands of square miles acres to patrol. So that's one way that he learned so much about what America was like. He was a deputy U.S. Marshal, and he would have to, if somebody stole some horses, he'd give chase to them. If somebody robbed a stagecoach and stole the U.S. mail, he'd have to go chase them down. In fact, he and Buffalo Bill Cody, who were very close friends, were serving as U.S. Marshals together, and some of their adventures are in the book.
Years ago, there was a TV show called The Young Riders with these gentlemen, among others, as, teenagers. And
yes.
They're riding back and forth with the Pony Express. Was that true?
Yes, in fact, Buffalo Bill Cody was a Pony Express rider. Some stories have had Hickok as a Pony Express rider, but they needed people who were shorter and lighter. Now, Hickok was a big, imposing guy. He was 6'1", which at that time was about 5 or 6 inches taller than the average height of an American male. Long brown hair, well built, well muscled guy. He was very imposing and intimidating, and also he was catnip to the ladies. I mean, there's a passage in the book where George Custer's wife meets him for the first time, and she just swoons and breathlessly describes their encounter in her diary.
Catnip to the ladies.
That's what I want to be. I'm going to use that on a T-shirt if it's okay with you. So the book is called Wild Bill: The True Story of an American Frontier's First Gunfighter. Tell me about the rules of dueling. Let's see. He shot and killed Davis Tuff, right?
Yes.
What
yes.
Are there rules about that kind of thing? How does that work?
The rules changed. That's why when he shot Davis Tutt in Springfield, Missouri in July 1865, previous to that, you had mentioned earlier Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. There were very strict rules about you go back to back, you each have a pistol, you pace off, you turn, you shoot. Many times you just shoot in the air. You don't really try and hit the other person. Just showing up was satisfying honor. But with Hickok and Davis Tutt, a gunfight in 1865, that was the first recorded time, anyway, that we know about, where two men faced off against each other, and it was a quick draw. Who drew the fastest and who could shoot the most accurately? And it was Hickok in both cases. He was a very fast draw, and he was a very accurate shooter. He could shoot equally well with his left or right hand. That's why he kept two pistols on his gun belt, because he could shoot just as well with both. And so that changed things. From that point on, it became more the duel or the gunfight we know today from movies and television shows, where two guys would stare each other down, and then one of them would draw, and whoever drew first and shot better was the winner. Is
that what happened when, because of that duel and everything, is that where the gun manufacturers came about, so they could get these guys to use their guns?
Well, there always have been gun manufacturers. There's been no lack of gun manufacturers. So what would happen, though, is that a gunfighter, though, would start to adapt their pistols a little bit. Like they would Hickok would do something with his trigger so that it would shoot a little faster. But it did mean, yes, you're right. It did mean that there was in the West a greater demand for guns. I mean, part of it was not so much to be gunfighters, but just self-protection. You had a lot of these wagon trains and isolated parties of people that were crossing great distances. They might be subjected to attacks by Indians who saw them as intruders. So you needed, there was quite a demand for guns on the American West.
Did any of the stories that became national stories in his day influence legislation at all, federal or national legislation?
Not that I can think of. He was not a political figure, other than being, like I say, very anti-slavery because of his family's abolitionists. But But he was not as a political figure. I can't think of anything any issue in particular he would have been involved in that would have inspired. I mean, there was all kinds of political stuff going on when he was in Kansas during the bloody Kansas years. But he was just trying to survive those violent incidents. He wasn't necessarily a leader of anything.
Right. Is his gravesite still accessible?
Yes, if people go to Deadwood, South Dakota, you'll find his gravesite there because that's where he was killed in 1876. And you will find buried next to him Calamity Jane, which some people say was done as a practical joke on Hickok, and some people say it's because it was Calamity Jane's last wish. You know, she fell in love with Hickok, and when she died years later, she wanted to be buried next to him. Hickok really didn't want to have anything to do with her. Plus, he had just a few weeks earlier married, finally, after years of courtship, the love of his life, Agnes Lake.
Oh, wow. Okay. And I was wondering about that. I was wondering if there was a relationship there. So that was a joke, I guess, huh? Or something. Wow. How old was she? I mean, how old was Calamity Jane when she died?
Calamity Jane was, I believe, I don't even know if she got to be 50. She was probably 50-ish, late 40s. Yeah. She died in 1903. And in the years after, I mean, she lived like another 25 years plus after Hickok died. And she would tell anybody who would listen that they did have this relationship. There was this great romance between them. She even claimed they had a child together. None of this was true, but you know, she was somebody who liked to burnish. Let's put it gently, burnish her reputation.
Did he have to put up with challengers? Like, just because he had this reputation of being a good shot? I mean, did people sometimes just want to challenge him for the sake of challenging?
Yes, because, you know, and we've seen this sometimes in movies and television shows, the aging gunfighter who has to be careful because there's somebody around the corner who could be younger and faster, and who realizes, you know, the way I'm going to become known as the fastest gun in the West is by knocking off the guy who was known as the fastest gun in the West. So he did spend his later years knowing there was a bullseye on his back, and every so often, you know, people would challenge him. But, you know, he remained until his dying day the undefeated heavyweight champ of gunfighters.
And did George Nichols have an important role to play in that when he wrote the article?
He did. He wrote his article for Harper's New Monthly magazine, and he too was fascinated by Hickok, the way he looked. You know, he was a very handsome, tall man of the plains. And Hickok told him some stories of his adventures. Nichols made up a few to go along with those. Wow. And the article was published in Harper's New Monthly magazine, and it was a sensation all up and down the East Coast, where most of its readers were, about this magnetic, charismatic frontier lawman and scout and marshal, and who knew every inch of the plains. And Hickok became that image, that celebrity image of what the American frontier was like.
I have a copy of the book. I'd like to give it away if I have a listener who would like it. It's simply called Wild Bill, The True Story of the American Frontier's First Gunfighter. And I have it here. I'm trying to see something. New York Times bestselling author of Dodge City. Oh, there you go. Tom Clavin, of course, is the author. The book is also available as an audiobook, hardcover, and Kindle, it says here, right? Were you happy with the way the audiobook came out?
Yes, you know, it's amazing what's happened in book publishing in the last few years, how much more popular audiobooks are. You know, there's probably several reasons you could think about that. You might have more people that are used to now listening to books in their cars when they're commuting or driving long distances. You know, my son, when he was going to school at the University of Buffalo, and he'd drive back and forth from home, he could finish a whole book on the trip to Buffalo. You may have maybe an aging of the audience a bit, where audiobook is a little easier on the ears and less strain on the eyes. But yeah, the audiobook it turned out very, very well, and I'm very happy with the Macmillan folks who did that and the person they hired to do it.
I'm a big fan of audiobooks, and I can tell you I can tell you why in my case, because Robin and I have to read so much that there's really no time to read for enjoyment. So an audiobook in the car, you know, gets that. It's much better than, well, I shouldn't say something bad about talk radio, but it's much better. All right, let me give this one away real quickly. Good morning. You've got the book. Who's this?
Thank you so much again. This is Gene.
Gene, you got it. It'll be waiting for you here at the station. Thank you so much.
I'll read it in one night.
In one night? Well, good for you.
Oh, yeah.
All right.
Who did Wild Bill admire? Did he have a self-proclaimed mentor?
Early in his earlier days, I mean, his father was somebody who he admired. His father was a farmer, and like I said, was very involved in helping runaway and escaped slaves. So he learned a lot from his father about treating people compassionately and treating people fairly. He also had, when he first got out to Kansas, there were a couple of older hands there who took him under his wing and introduced him to people. But most, Hickok was, and he was a well-liked guy. He enjoyed telling stories. People enjoyed his stories, but he was a loner in a lot of ways too. He was like this solitary knight of the frontier, roaming around, and sometimes he'd stop someplace to do some gambling and to hang out for a bit. And sometimes he'd run into trouble, and he'd try and work things out with the trouble. His motto sort of was, I will treat you as you treat me, and he never looked for trouble, but every so often, he would be backed into a corner because somebody was forcing a fight, and if he had to fight, he would, and he would be the one left standing.
So was that gunslinger reputation, does it overshadow other contributions and accomplishments that we need to know about?
It can, because I think the connotation of gunfighter, at the time, it was synonymous with another phrase, which was man killer. And a gunfighter was oftentimes thought to be on the wrong side of the law. So, but Hickok was, like I say, he served a couple of times as marshal. He was of Hays City and of Abilene, Kansas. He was the deputy U.S. marshal. He really believed in law enforcement and a rough kind of justice system they had in the West at that time. Mm-hmm. So he did have to. There was a reputation. There's a quote in the book about a woman who was keeping a diary when she met Hickok. I think it was in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and she notes in her diary after having a conversation with him, he's not what I expected. He was a gentleman, and he was a nice guy. He was a good guy. She got this good feeling from him, not what she expected.
And what made him go on the stage?
Well, he had left being marshal of Abilene. He was gambling. He was maybe not quite looking for a job, but kind of hanging out a little too much than he should. And Buffalo Bill Cody came up to him and said, "I have this play called Scouts of the Plains, and it's basically you, me, and a couple other people sitting around a campfire, talking about our adventures on the prairie." And Hickok said, I'm not an actor. What do I know about the stage? And Buffalo Bill said, we'll give you $100 a week. Hickok said, sign me up.
Wow.
And so they started doing this play, a couple of out-of-town tryouts, and it proved to be quite popular. And then it opened up in New York, and it was a smash hit on Broadway. Because as you can imagine, you had all these people who've been hearing about these Western legends, right, Cody and Hickok, for years. Suddenly they can go to a theater in the West 40s, put a few dollars down, and see the real people up on the stage. It was a smash hit, and Hickok did it for as long as he could stand being an actor. And then one night he couldn't. He shot the spotlights out and left, and never came back.
Oh, what an exit! I love that.
Oh
exit.
My gosh,
that's great.
That's a cool part of the story.
Do you think he was happy though most of his life?
I think he was happy, I think he felt that he respected others and people respected him. I think in his later years he started to understand that the West had passed him by. He couldn't really adapt to a different kind of West where you had peace officers, not marshals, and you couldn't wear guns in town anymore, and gambling was being outlawed in a lot of towns that he liked to hang out in. And the West was sort of passing him by, and that's why at the very end of his life when he was at Deadwood, South Dakota, he had this premonition, and he said to a friend of his, I don't think I'm going to leave here alive, and he turned out to be right.
Wow.
Tom Clavin, thank you so much for taking time to speak to us today. Good luck with the book. Again, it's called Wild Bill. I found it on Amazon, and TomClavin.com is your website, correct?
It is.
All right, Tom. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
We'll be right back.
Broadcasting from the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.